Hello, everyone. Yet once again, it's another day of fresh grace and mercy. This is the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast, where we bridge the gap to Reformed Christian theology for your listening pleasure. And today we're doing a book club episode with Andrew Wilson. He is the author of Remaking the World, How 1776 Created the Post-Christian West, published by Crossway. So this episode is brought to us by Crossway. So go to our show notes, click the Crossway link, takes you right to this book, Andrew's book, and you can purchase it for yourself. I'll go back to our tradition where I read an endorsement from a guest we've had on before, Karen Swallow Pryor. She's been on our book a couple times, and I'll read the endorsement she had for this book. She says, "Few books offer as compelling, rich, and insightful cultural analysis that covers so much ground as this one. It's history for history lovers and for the rest of us." And I personally, and I know Peter too, we love history on this show. We love talking about how Christianity and history and explain all that stuff. So we really enjoyed this book. You can also go to our show notes and find other reminders that we always bring up on every episode. So how to communicate with Peter and myself, Twitter, Instagram, watch these conversations on YouTube, and then just how to find a church to call home if you don't have a church that you're a member of. There's a local church finder. And then just more information about who our confessional podcast network is. We started a podcast network with other like-minded confessional reformed podcasts out there. Take a look at that website. There's a list of the other ones that we're friends with, and listen to those podcasts as well. And then our website, our personal website as well. We got a lot of new things we're working on and updating. So it's a fun time right now for Peter and myself. But we love these book club episodes, and this is another really great book, very edifying. So we'll let Peter further introduce Andrew Wilson today.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to introduce to our audience Dr. Andrew Wilson, who's the teaching pastor at King's Church London and a columnist for Christianity Today. He's the author of several books, including Incomparable, Echoes of Exodus, which I actually just read and finished last week, kind of in preparation for this, and God of All Things. He is married to Rachel, and they have 3 children, Zeke, Anna, and Samuel. Thanks for coming on, Dr. Wilson.
Thank you so much for having me. It's brilliant to be with you.
Of course, yeah. So first question, kind of an icebreaker, but also part of our first question that we emailed over is, let our listeners know a little bit more about Andrew Wilson, kind of beyond his ecclesiastical and his academic bio.
And
how much he loves playing board games with his 2 kids that he,
I know exactly.
That he
I think that's the way to go,
come on this show.
I have 3 children, 2 of whom just yelled at me as I was late to come on this recording, and the third of whom, my daughter, who's actually got quite profound disabilities, is marauding around downstairs. I can hear her, and I'm not quite sure what's going to happen there, what I might find. She may be going through the cupboards, so we will see. Yes, my parenting is probably the yeah, that's probably the most challenging area of my life. Many parents may be able to relate, and 2 of our 3 kids have got quite profound special needs. So that's been quite a formative thing for us and our family. It's probably something that a lot of people have, when we've got to know people, it's one of the first things people notice about our home and our family life. So yeah, that's probably the most important thing outside of ministry that most people might need to know about me. Yeah.
Awesome. So next question, based off of this book, and you're writing this book, so people might know you, and I guess I knew you, didn't know you personally, but knew you kind of in writing more as a theologian and maybe less as a historian. But this book, it might change some minds. It's a little bit of both, probably heavier weighted towards history. So for lack of a better way of asking, maybe you've been asked this before, maybe you asked yourself this: what's a theologian doing writing a book on quote unquote secular history, and where did this idea even come from?
Yeah, so I did study history and theology. History was my first love, I think, academically.
Yeah.
And then I switched to theology, which you could do at the university I was at, and then specialize more in that. in some ways, I'm not really a theologian either. My PhD was in biblical studies, so that's rather than theology proper.
Sure.
And so I've never really studied that much.
You've had no
theology.
home, no academic home. Really.
Well, it is like that. When you study theology, you actually do a module on history and a module on philosophy, and like so that's very much my background. That sort of that fusion. This book, it came out really because the idea grew out of an attempt to try and do cultural apologetics, I think. So it's really that was where the interface between understanding the church, understanding evangelism and mission, understanding the history of Christian thought, but very much within the sort of philosophical and material environment that we're in the post-Christian West, if you want to use that term.
Yeah.
And trying to understand how that world has been formed. And it's really very much the practitioner. It's the sort of that's driving the idea. The idea is to try and tell a story that helps people make sense of why the world is the way it is and where they are on the map and how it got there and how therefore we might respond to it. So in that sense, it's not theological in the sort of sense of speculation about God, but it is in the sense of trying to help equip pastors, evangelists, missionaries, thinkers, thoughtful Christians who just live in a world like this and want to understand the way it works and how we might serve it better.
Yeah. Before next question, this wasn't on the list, but I think this might be helpful for people to kind of orient their brains around. Does this share any similarities? Is this somewhat like, or maybe kind of in the same vein of like Carl Trueman's work, The Rise and Triumph of Modern? Is that somewhat similar to this book?
Yeah, it is. I think what Carl's book does is he goes into more detail on one of these lines of inquiry, effectively. So I sort of trace 7 developments in the history of the post-Christian West, and Carl's book really traces one, and does it in a lot more detail. So he looks at that sort of the romanticism, the concept of the self, which overlaps quite a lot with one of my chapters.
That's right. Yep.
And then my book then tries to do that with 7 developments, and therefore of necessity doesn't do them in as much detail, but so it's a slightly sort of broader, but perhaps less deep dive into 7 stories.
Cool. Yeah. So if those who are listening, if you enjoyed Trueman's work, I think you're going to like Dr. Wilson's work as well.
Well, that's very kind of you.
Yeah. Trueman's book.
I mean, they're two Brits writing about American history, I guess, but which is kind of funny, which bridges into next question.
I think a lot of the most interesting stuff, you might be about to ask about this, but I think a lot of the most interesting stuff about the post-Christian world at the moment is being written by people in the English people.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's interesting.
Charles Taylor, Jamie Smith, Chris Watkin, Glenn
Not
Scrivener,
a single one of them are American.
Truman. No, well, I mean, there are good Americans writing too.
Yeah, totally. But the ones people think of, generally speaking, are not from America.
Yeah, true. Good point. Yeah, and
I think there's probably a good reason for that. Which is I think it's that Europe and Australia are much further down that process.
That's right. Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Good point. Yeah. Carl Trueman's book, he was the very first book club we ever did on our show.
Yeah, that's right.
Wow.
Early 2021. Yeah.
And if I may, based on you're talking about the idea and goal of your book, if I may, there's you even mentioned it in your book, the big idea of this book is that 1776, more than any other year in the last millennium, is the year that made us who we are. 1776 provides us an origin story for the post-Christian West. So hold on, my computer. So if I could make a cheeky comment,
a cheeky dad American joke.
Yeah, I'm gonna make a cheeky comment, and that's I think what you Brits say. It's a kind of a term, but I know Peter and I are Americans, so we know that you Brits are still pretty upset about losing to us rebels in the Revolutionary War, right? So based on this subtitle, how 1776 created the post-Christian West from a British author, what is this suggesting or providing as the goal of your book?
So part of this obviously is that I think Americans are particularly interested in that. If you say it to British people, they don't know what happened in that year at all. It's not a date that resonates to most of my friends, unless they're quite educated, wouldn't know.
Yeah.
So for Americans, it's partly intended to draw people in, but it is to say that actually in this year that the Declaration of Independence happened, you also have this myriad of other major developments taking place: the invention of the steam engine, the publication of the Wealth of Nations, the European Enlightenment, the beginning of an explosive economic growth, the dawn of Romanticism. and key figures, David Hume, Diderot, Voltaire, look, many Kant drafting the Critique of Pure Reason. Like, it's a really, really important year. I know that Americans will immediately connect the idea with one particular set of events, and that is undoubtedly an important one. But arguably, it isn't even the most important one that takes place in this year for forming the world as it currently is. I think it is a particular democracy is a vital part of what it is to be a Western person today. But there are many other threads that are a major part of that don't have very much to do with the American Revolution. And so much of what the book is trying to do is to expand the importance of that year and use it as a lens through which to tell a very big story about the origins of the West as we are now, in which America is obviously an important part, but it's not the only part. So yes, there is a facetious undertone to it, and it is indeed cheeky to use that word. But that's not all it is. It is because I think this year is genuinely incredibly important for understanding how the world that we're in now came to be what it was.
Yeah, so you're not just miffed and then wrote this book against Americans.
To be honest, no. I mean, it's one of those things where it's a war that, with hindsight, you're actually quite pleased to have lost. So I think so. It's like the British were fighting the French, and America was the proxy. But
like, I might have lost the battle, but I didn't lose the war.
10 or 15 years later, Britain's doing fine, and French are chopping everybody's heads off. So it was one of those wars that you actually wanted to lose.
There you go. Absolutely. So you call us, I mean, this is not just you, but you bring up some other kind of studies. You call us, we're a weird people. You write about our quirkiness, our weirdness in chapter 2, and it really does find its way through every book or every chapter in this book. So I'm going to ask, I know this is an acronym, so if you can explain this acronym and how it finds its way throughout the book. What is so weird about us?
So the acronym WEIRD is actually an acronym that psychologists have used for 10 or 15 years now to refer to the kinds of people who are listening to this podcast, which is Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And I add to and turn it into weirder. So I add ex-Christian and romantic, because I think that weird is a good psychological profile.
We're not even just weird. We're really weird.
We are. And partly that's, again, a little play on words, but partly it's because I think that romanticism and Christianity are incredibly important parts of the story at an ideological level, not just describing our material and political circumstances, which is more what the WEIRD acronym does. So I'm wanting to add the Christian and romantic components of the story to broaden it a bit. And obviously, as a pastor, I'm very interested in ideas and how Christianity and romanticism shape the world we're in too. So that's what that acronym is trying to do. And I then use that really to sort of summarize these 7 transformations I mentioned: globalization, enlightenment, industrialization, enrichment, democracy, ex-Christianity, romanticism, are all ways of trying to get at the things that make our kind of society distinctive, and to help us understand what it is about it that is different from the other 6 or 7 billion people who live on planet Earth, and to understand, therefore, as missionaries to our culture and as pastors and thinkers, how we can best serve it.
Gotcha. Yeah. So building off of this, there's another big theme. So weirder is one theme. Another big theme is, just like you said, the particular year 1776. It's not just like kind of the time, of course it's the time period, but there's something about the year 1776 in particular. The amount of culture shaping literature published, like you said, wars fought, deaths during this year, births during this year, amongst some of the other things that are truly astounding. So can you talk a little bit about like what events occurred particularly so in this year and around this year that find their zenith or their genesis during this time to create this common weird world?
Yes, I think I started in Britain. So even just there's a weekend where James Watt's steam engine starts running on March the 8th, and then the very next day, Adam Smith releases the foundational text of modern economics, The Wealth of Nations, in March. That's 3 weeks after Edward Gibbon's History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire has been released.
It's just one thing after another.
It's just mad. And then, of course, you've got the American War. Then Captain Cook set sail in the summer for the South Seas in the third of his voyages. And then in Germany, you have Kant drafting the Critique of Pure Reason. You have the Sturm und Drang movement gathering in Weimar, Goethe and Herder and Singer and others. And that play, Sturm und Drang, gets written, which is the kind of harbinger of proto-romanticism. And Rousseau is in Paris, but he's surrounded by Diderot and Baron d'Holbach and all these other kind of key characters. So I mean, it's just a remarkably, even in just those 3 Western European nations, there's many others you could draw in on top of what's going on in the States and elsewhere. So it's a very, very significant time intellectually, economically, materially, industrially.
So much like the Western kind of great works canon was either like finishing publication or starting publication around this time, which we don't realize really just how shaped we are by this time period.
Yeah, we are, and that actually the subjects now, it's not just that it's one of the early important periods of publishing. It's just that it is now almost impossible to conceive of writing about economics without Adam Smith, or writing history without Edward Gibbon, or writing philosophy without Immanuel Kant. So it's not just that they're important works in their own right; it's that they are sort of fountainheads for the way that modern people write about those subjects and have done ever since. And there are, say something about feminism with Mary Wollstonecraft, or saying something about novel writing, or there's so many important developments like that can be boiled down really to this kind of period. Educational theory with Rousseau. So it's a very, very important period for thinking about the West as we are. And this 1 year happens to be a particularly good way of telling that story, I think. I hope it is anyway.
So
tell me.
Before next question, this might be a hard question to answer, but maybe like, what is it about this time period, what like leading up to this time period and kind of jumping off in this time period, where like it does seem so different than, I don't know, 1812 or 1865 or 1492, like all the big time periods that we generally think of as world shaped. What is it particularly so about coming into this time period that then so shaped all of Western history, particularly so?
Yes, I mean, I think probably 1492 is the other year that would be.
That's what I think. Generally, Americans like kind of glob onto that one in 1770.
I think so. I think that would be. I think 1453, 1492, 1517. There are a few big years that really do shape everything, and this is one of those. But I think, to me, what makes it compelling is that it bridges so many of those different transformations I talked about, that it isn't just a significant moment in the political sphere or in the geographical, in the journey of globalization. It's also incredibly intellectually significant, and economically and technologically and industrially. In many ways, I think the most important development is I make this point in one of the chapters, that if you stood in the year 3000 and look back at 1776, a lot of people are going to be very fuzzy on what the Declaration of Independence actually said. It'll be like the Magna Carta is today or something.
People today are fuzzy on the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, maybe. But what everybody will still see is that if you draw a chart of the economic progress of the human race, you will see the inflection point. It shoots up the hockey stick in the middle of the 1770s. And that has quite a lot to do with the Industrial Revolution, which obviously is a major contribution, no matter what the intellectual debates and political developments of the period had been. But because they all happen at once, Enlightenment, industrialization, the emergence of democracy in the American experiment, and the sort of the economic explosion and industrial technology I've described, that all happening at once is bound to make this an incredibly powerful cocktail that will shape us ever since. So it's not that I think any one of those developments is more important than the Reformation or the discovery of America. It's just so many of them happen in 1 year. I think it's a really great story and a very important one to understand.
Yeah, it's almost like before, the last one, but almost like before this and maybe after it too, like a single defining element occurred in one of these years and then kind of helped. But this one, a conglomeration of events came up and then transformed a lot of what we do and how we think today, versus just maybe a quote unquote a single event or a single thing that occurred.
Yes, exactly. That's very well put. It's the fusion of those multiple different events happening at once that makes it so important and significant for all subsequent generations, I think, rather than one massive explosive thing.
Gotcha. Cool.
Yeah, and especially speaking to an American audience, I think this is helpful because as Americans, we think of 1776 Revolutionary War. That's it. But this is a reminder.
Like just an American event, like American history.
But now with this conversation in this book, you're realizing globally there's so much else going on in that year that's actually helping explain the West and what you're bringing in with post-Christian West. So very helpful. So my next question is, based on your background, obviously you knew a lot of stuff going into this book, and then as you're researching it, you're learning more too, as all authors are on this stuff, and you're always learning more as you're working on things going forward. So based on your background and everything, who are some of your intellectual mentors, uh, both maybe living and dead? I mean, you're a historian, so probably a lot of dead ones, and sources that you really used for this book. In other words, do you have any theological heroes that you look to, or historians,
people you really
that
leaned on when you
Yeah.
researched this?
for inspiration?
Yeah,
and help?
that's a really good question, and it's very difficult to answer it without it sounding very self-aggrandizing. What you want to do is to say, well, Augustine, and you're like, yeah, this is
Yeah.
do you know what I mean?
Go for it.
You don't want to.
Yeah.
Clearly, you're not. You know what? You're an idiot if you compare yourself to what Augustine does in City of God. But I think what's helpful about it is it's a model of that he provides a model for trying to for trying to tell the story of your civilization in a theological way. He's a model of doing what I would call theological history, and effectively to say there is a very good reason for wanting to tell the story of how your society came to be as it is through very explicitly theological lenses, trying to understand it as a product of what people love and who they worship and so on, because that is the big driver in society. So I mean, but that sounds absurdly self-aggrandizing to say I'm doing the equivalent of that. It's like, no, you're not. But I actually think as an attempt that's obviously a very important model and pattern, which many people who are trying to do that kind of thing now would self-consciously say, yeah, I mean, Chris Watkin does the same in his big book, Biblical Critical Theory. I think, Keller would always say that this is what we need. We need people doing high theory on culture and trying to outflank it and think about how it exists within a Christian frame, rather than the world saying, hey, here's how Christianity fits within a secular story. You're trying to do the reverse. And I think Truman, you've already mentioned, he does a great, as I say, does a good example of that particularly on the intellectual genealogy side. I found his work, I was well into this project when I encountered it, but found his work incredibly helpful. He actually did a theological conference for us while I was working on the project during lockdown, and it was very helpful. Peter Lightheart, who I think is another great thinker, just like he's polymathic in his range of things that, and so I think those would be a few examples of people today, Keller, Truman, guys like that, who have really helped me generated a lot of ideas, many of whom have then got almost Jamie Smith would be another, that have sort of sparked lots of insights, which have then, I don't blame them for anything I say in the book, but they've been really helpful at probably trying to integrate some of the disciplines I'm trying to in the way I have.
Gotcha.
So it's helpful, maybe in conjunction with your book, extra credit for the audience, read Augustine's City of God.
Yeah, it'll take you a lot longer than this book. Yeah, totally. Yeah. So I want to highlight two chapters in particular, and then Nick will ask a kind of a similar question to this. I personally was fascinated, and I think this will be the case for a lot who read this. I was fascinated by two chapters in particular. So I want to see if we can dive into two of them, and I'll ask one question at a time. So first I want to ask about is maps. And I think people are like, why are you talking about maps? What do maps have to do with intellectual history? We're gonna ask that question. So about maps, what is it about geography, topography, weather? I want to be a meteorologist when I grew up. So this kind of fascinated me, talking about some of this stuff, and like some of the weather changes and stuff made sense to me. I don't know if it was exciting for anybody else but me, but so you got one fan of this chapter in me, and then these play a role. So geography, topography, weather, all this stuff, migration patterns, agriculture, how they play a role in the formation of the economy. And I really want to dig into this because you talk about it, and to an extent that it's not usually discussed. So the question being, we'll look at a certain groups like, well, they're just not good at this because that's who they are. They're just not good at this stuff. But you actually make the case that this has more to do with how land is formed, how weather plays a pattern in this, all this. So maybe you can talk, how does geography play into intellectual history?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and one that animates me a lot in the book. I'd probably draw it in about 3 of the different chapters, because I think it's very important that I think what people who are interested, particularly people who are interested in a podcast like this, we're ideas people. Like we love ideas, we love tracing how that idea creates this one and how that creates an intellectual response. And what, if I to put it in very theological terms, what can happen is you can become quite Gnostic. You can see you see,
forget about
in
the
the sense
physical.
of, you forget about the physical, you forget about matter, you forget about the fact that the reason why this society has developed faster than that one is not necessarily or even perhaps at all because it had better ideas,
which is
in the
precisely
Bronze
Jamie
Age.
Smith's kind of thesis throughout all of his books. Is like, we're not thinking sticks, we're people, like we're flesh.
Yeah, so he's doing it from the perspective, obviously, of contemporary people,
Yeah.
and how we are formed and how our ideas formed. I'm then doing effectively taking that idea back into the Bronze Age, or back 10,000 years, and saying, well, hang on, if you go back there, the reason why the people who are descended from people who came from Western Eurasia or from Eastern Eurasia in China are the two ethnic groups who have become most dominant in the sort of developed quicker and become dominant in the way the world is today, is because of geographical factors about how easy it was.
It's not because they're smarter than us naturally.
No, it's because they had a huge, many thousand years head start on people who lived in, say, Australasia when it came to domesticating animals and farming and weather and growing stuff, and then you end up being able to develop cities earlier, which means you develop writing earlier and ideas and that sort of thing. And if you don't see that, I think one of the things that happens is you do think of us as thinking sticks, and you over ideologize everything. Another thing that happens is you underplay providence, and another thing that happens is you can actually become very culturally arrogant, and you can think, oh, the reason why at its worst, Christian civilization produces Mozart. That civilization doesn't. You think, whoa. There are components. There are degrees to which that's true in certain areas, but a lot of this is no. Christian civilization emerged in the same kind of cultures that produced Mozart for reasons that have nothing to do with either Christianity or classical music, and an awful lot to do with things like, as you say, weather and soil and what grows and what animals are around and so on. So I wanted to tell that story to avoid the arrogance. I think that's probably the main motive, and the racism, which is often in the background if we're not careful of a lot of these stories. And I then want to put the ideas back into the story as we do in other chapters. But I think if you start there, you just neglect what's really going on 5,000 years.
Maybe you can dig into a little more if we get to my second part, the second chapter, dig in like maybe a little bit of a preview, like what is it about kind of like land masses, like how big is it, like east, like you talk about east to west, you talk about north and south, like if they're long, if they're horizontally long or whatever, maybe vertically long versus horizontal, like what, maybe preview, like what is it about some of these these geographical patterns that produces societies like this?
So if I took you back 10,000 years and I said, where in the world do you want to live? Do you want to live in Eurasia? Do you want to live in America? Do you want to live in Africa? Or do you want to live in Australasia? There would be, if you just had a sprinkling of common sense and a good relief map, you would have good reasons for saying, I want to live in Eurasia. And because Eurasia is, as you say, it's a wide continent rather than a tall one, which means you can when you move east to west, you can
there's less weather pattern change across the continent,
and soil change. Also, if you move north to south, you can't move a few miles a day and gradually transport the things you grow in Southern America to Northern America, which is why potatoes didn't reach North America from South America. They only reached them when Europeans arrived. And then, so things, and many examples like that. You would want to live in a country where, in an area where you have pigs and horses and sheep and cows, not in an area where the local animals are zebras and lions or kangaroos and, wallabies. They're just much easier to domesticate. Eat, to get wool and all that sort of. And you want wood, you want water, you want steady weather patterns, you want enough rain but not too much. So basically we are, and that's where the lands of the Bible, to be honest, Western Eurasia is a very good place to be, the Fertile Crescent. And that's why all the civilizations we know about either originated in China between the Yangtze and the Yellow Rivers, or in Western Eurasia for many thousands of years before anybody else was getting what we might call a civilization. I think that's significant in understanding our origin story as people.
Totally. Yeah. The reason why people might be wondering, why are you asking about geography? And it's because it's a chapter in the book on maps. And like you said, it finds its way in other chapters. But it's also, and you talk about this with kind of Enlightenment period figures who kind of think like we're the top dogs. Like we have all the knowledge, we have all the language, we have all the history, we have all the philosophy. All these other primitive peoples can't do what we can do because we're smarter, we're better, and gosh darn it, we're going to do it. But they're not taking into account like this land that we have has allowed us to produce some of this stuff. So that's the first part. Second part is skeptics. We've had a few books on before talking about skeptics, but not to say there are no skeptics previous to the turn of the 19th century, but they sure multiply. What's so distinct about skeptics in this era?
Yeah, so skeptics is the word I use for people who I guess are in different ways pushing back against Christianity, whether that is literally in the sense of we are doubters philosophically, which obviously many of them were, or just people who are quite bombastically saying, no, we need to get rid of the Christian God and come up with a different way of thinking about morality or whatever it is. And I think you have a bunch of things taking place which make it easier to see. So there's a number of things taking place at this period which make that an appealing or a compelling way of thinking. Some of it is economic development. Some of it is the outgrowth of the fallout of the Protestant Reformation, which doesn't happen instantly, but obviously the Enlightenment as we had as so-called could not have happened in 1400 as it did, because the structure of Christendom was still very robust at that time, even though it was beginning to fray around the edges. But by the 18th century, you have not just the Protestant Reformation and the divisions that it brings within the church, but it's also percolated through to the divisions between nation states in the 17th century, the 30 Years' War, the English Civil War, and so on. And then you've also got technological developments and voyages of discovery, which are raising other grounds for skepticism about Christianity, and also providing a new way of. It's not really that they're going, we're not sure about God anymore. Mm-hmm. It's more that they're coming up with new ways of thinking about humanity and the way the cosmos works, which they're beginning to go, hang on a second, could we do this with a smaller role for God? Could we do this with a bigger role for human beings? So it's less a subtraction story and more a sort of new creative way of thinking about the world and our place in it and where God might fit within that. Very few people have gone to full-blown atheism by this point, but there's a lot more reasons for people saying, like Franklin famously did, these things are we don't need these truths to be sacred and undeniable. They're self-evident. Now that's just because Christianity had baked those things so deeply into the culture that people no longer thought they were up for debate. But that meant people could keep the moral insistences of Christianity without regarding the metaphysics of Christianity as necessary. And that's effectively what began to happen in this period, most famously, of course, in the Declaration of Independence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know I have one last question to end the episode, as we only have a few minutes left. But during this conversation, before I ask it, it just dawned on me. I've been waiting for a British historian to say a useless fact about me that you may be one of the few people on the planet that find interesting. My 26th great-grandfather is King John, who wrote the Magna Carta.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
So
that's very good family research somebody's done.
Right.
Yeah. Ancestry stuff.
You're Sir Nick Fullweiler.
Yeah. So most people's
Lord
eyes
Nick,
gloss over when I say that.
In fairness to him, he didn't really write the Magna Carta. He kind of got handed it and got told, if you don't agree to this, then you've got a lot of problems.
Didn't have much of a choice.
Yeah. That's true. So but King John, 26th great-grandfather. So
wow.
Anyway, Plantagenet family. Yeah. So last question. Christians can be really good at calling out the evils in our secular post-Christian society, and we're blind to the opportunities to share the gospel hope to those searching within pure humanly pursuits and vainglory. What opportunities do Christians have to engage in this society that we're either not aware of or that we have not taken advantage of?
What opportunities are there for Christians to engage in a society like ours that we're not aware of?
Yeah, we're either, because I think, it's either decry society and say, oh, they're just kind of going to hell in a handbasket, but we don't see the opportunities that we have to engage, like you talk about in this book.
Yes, I think one of the things I'm trying to do in the book is to show people the extent to which some things that now seem hostile to Christian faith and may well be are in fact outgrowths of Christian. They're the results of Christian thinking and activity in previous centuries, and so we have a slightly complicated relationship to them. But I think that presents us with a lot of opportunities, as you say, because it means that, for instance, we're able to say, it's a way of what you say to people is not, here's what you believe and here's why you're wrong, but here's what you believe and here's why you're right. Now you might also need to do the other one too, by the way, but you can say, yeah, so you believe in, an obvious one would be you believe in human rights. Why? Like, human rights do not follow from a materialist evolutionary account of origins. Now you might believe in evolution, you might not, you might be a little bit materialist or not very, or very much. But if you believe that everything is matter, and that the strong eat the weak, and that everything is ultimately subatomic collisions taking place, and consciousness is almost a sort of mysterious outgrowth of something that's fundamentally happening at a molecular level, it's very difficult to find any basis for saying all human beings are created in the image of God, or even all human beings have human dignity. And and just because you have an upright spine and a large cranium and opposable thumbs, you should be treated with almost infinite dignity. Like my daughter, who you may be able to hear in the background, very low cognitive functioning at the age of 13. But everyone, you say, people pay a tremendous amount of taxes in our country in order to make sure that she's looked after and educated. And you think that happens because of Christian convictions about what a human being is. It's because millions of people said she's created in the image of God, and therefore she's worth. She's not out of economic utility. It's not out of evolutionary adaptability. It's out of theology that conviction comes. Now that's one good example, but you can say, hey, so you believe something good, you actually believe it for Christian reasons. It doesn't follow from the premises of the way you believe. What you actually, your metaphysics don't produce that conclusion. My metaphysics do, but I want you to affirm that and say, so let me tell you the story as to how that came to be believed. And that's a big part of what I'm trying to do in Remaking the World.
No, that's great. Yeah. Well, thank you, Dr. Wilson, so much. We don't realize how much borrowed capital is in it, where we can say, yes, you're actually dead on right when we talk to critics of the Christian religion, or whoever they may be, and say you actually have no reason to believe that stuff if you think about it logically. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. I really encourage people to read the book, to listen to this, give it a good listen, and see, why are things the way that they are? And it's not just because of course, there are people who hate God, but it's not just because of that. There's so many other factors into this. Well, thank you for writing this. Thank you for coming on. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me, guys.
Of course.
Thank you.